Frankfurt, summer 1942. The city's streets simmered with heat, and a faint haze of dust hung in the air, illuminated by the harsh sunlight reflecting off the brick and steel facades of factories lining the main river. The rhythm of industrial life was relentless, the clatter of machines mingling with the occasional rumble of distant artillery from the Eastern Front. Above it all, the shadow of the Third Reich loomed, a constant presence in the form of propaganda posters plastered on every wall, black uniformed officers patrolling the streets, and the fearful silence of neighbors who had learned the consequences of speaking out. At the heart of this industrial sprawl stood the Adler typewriter factory. Once a proud symbol of German craftsmanship and precision, Adler had become another cog in the war machine. Its sprawling complex, with brick chimneys belching smoke and enormous windows reflecting the sun in 1,000 shards, seemed ordinary to any passing soldier or official. But within its walls, the sound of typewriters clacking, gears turning, and conveyor belts humming masked a different kind of activity, one that would soon turn the Nazi leadership's assumptions about loyalty and control upside down. Jakob Stein, a man in his late 30s with hair already streaked with gray from years of labor and grief, moved among the assembly lines with a meticulous eye. His hands, calloused from decades of machining, hovered over the machines not to adjust them, but to scrutinize them, to imagine the potential for subtle imperfection, the way a master painter might examine a blank canvas for a brushstroke of possibility. He had lost his wife and 2 children during a bombing raid the previous year, a tragedy that had hollowed his chest and sharpened his mind. The grief had not broken him. It had forged a resolve that was as quiet as it was unyielding. Around him, workers toiled with mechanical precision. Women seated at the typewriter assembly stations clicked in rhythm, assembling keys, springs, and levers. Men hunched over heavy presses and coating machines, calibrating gears and circuits. The machines themselves were marvels of engineering, the keystrokes smooth, the hammers precise, the code mechanisms flawless. To the untrained observer, everything was perfect. To Jakob, perfection was the canvas upon which sabotage could be painted. The factory, under Nazi oversight, had shifted its focus from mere office equipment to the production of devices vital to military communication. Encryption machines, code transmitters, and typewriters designed to maintain the bureaucracy of war were now being churned out by the hundreds. Each machine, each meticulously engineered component was meant to streamline Nazi operations and tighten the Reich's grip across Europe. But Jakob and his allies had a different vision. In a small, concealed room beneath the factory, hidden behind a false wall in a storage area, Jakob convened a select group of trusted workers. The room was dimly lit, the air heavy with oil, dust, and the faint tang of secrecy. On a rough wooden table lay typewriter components, blueprints, and mechanical tools, intermixed with maps of the European theater of war and reports on German troop movements. Jakob's voice was steady, quiet, yet commanding. "We are making these machines not for them, but against them. Every gear, every spring, every code wheel we touch has the power to change the course of the war. Not with bullets, but with precision, with cunning, with intelligence." The workers leaned in, their faces pale from the tension and the heat, but their eyes glimmered with a shared determination. For months they had labored in silence, embedding minute defects in the machines. Springs were misaligned in ways almost imperceptible. Code wheels were subtly adjusted, enough to create errors under pressure. Typewriter keys were calibrated to fail after a certain number of uses. These were small acts, invisible to the inspectors and engineers of the Reich, yet they were potent weapons. Jakob taught his team how to encode messages within operational documents and technical schematics, creating a hidden communication network with the Allies. Notes were folded into the blueprints, disguised within diagrams, and smuggled out under the guise of routine business transactions. Each message carried vital intelligence, troop movements, production schedules, and technical specifications that, when received, would enable the Allies to disrupt Nazi operations without ever firing a shot. Despite the danger, a sense of grim excitement ran through the workers. Every day brought new challenges: Gestapo inspections, random audits, and the constant fear of betrayal by a colleague or a neighbor. They practiced subtle hand signals, used code phrases, and even devised small mechanical tricks to hide their work in plain sight. A gear that appeared perfectly aligned from the outside might be just enough off-center to jam a machine on a battlefield hundreds of miles away. A typewriter that seemed flawless could deliver critical miscommunication that delayed an entire operation. Jakob's leadership was rooted not only in skill, but in empathy. He knew the terror his team faced every day. He reminded them that the true measure of courage was persistence, not heroics. "The Reich believes it controls us through fear," he would say. "Let us show them that the human mind, the human spirit, cannot so easily commanded." His words, calm but electric with conviction, gave purpose to every action, transforming ordinary laborers into agents of extraordinary resistance. Outside the factory, Frankfurt continued under the oppressive hand of the Nazis. Propaganda screamed from posters and loudspeakers, warning of punishment for dissent, for sabotage, for even the smallest act of defiance. The Gestapo moved in the streets like shadows, interrogating, observing, disappearing anyone who raised suspicion. Yet within the fortress of the Adler factory, a quiet rebellion thrived, invisible but potent, a defiance constructed from gears, springs, and keystrokes. As the summer days dragged on, the workers of Adler moved with a duality of purpose: outwardly compliant, executing their assigned tasks with mechanical precision, yet inwardly subversive, threading tiny acts of sabotage into each machine. The factory itself seemed alive, its heart beating with secret defiance. Jakob would often pause in the midst of the clatter, listening to the rhythm of the assembly lines, imagining the chain reaction their subtle interventions would trigger in military operations across Europe. One day, a misaligned spring here, one faulty gear there, a coded error hidden in a shipment of typewriters. Each small act, multiplied thousands of times, would one day become the Nazis' worst nightmare. And so, in the sweltering heat of Frankfurt, under the oppressive watch of the Reich, the Adler typewriter factory began its transformation from a mere industrial enterprise into a crucible of resistance. The ordinary became extraordinary. The mundane became lethal. The clatter of typewriters and the hiss of steam machines, once symbols of bureaucracy and control, had become the quiet pulse of a rebellion that the Nazis would never see coming. Winter descended on Frankfurt in late 1943 with a harshness that seemed almost personal, as if the city itself mourned the thousands lost to bombing raids and military conscription. Snow dusted the cobblestones, turning streets into rivers of icy gray, and the chill seeped through the cracks of the Adler typewriter factory. Inside, the air was warmer but heavy with the tang of oil, metal, and secrecy. The machinery clattered with ceaseless rhythm, masking the quiet urgency of the workers who had become the lifeblood of an invisible resistance. Jacob Stein moved through the factory with a precision born of necessity. Each day he inspected the assembly lines, not merely to oversee production, but to ensure that every modification, every microscopic flaw was correctly embedded. He knelt beside a newly assembled typewriter, fingers tracing the subtle misalignment of the carriage return lever. "This one," he whispered to himself, "will ruin 1,000 reports by the time it reaches the front." His voice, barely audible over the machines, was more than a statement. It was a promise of silent rebellion. The workers, already skilled in their craft, had become adept at the art of subversion. Among them was Martha Weiss, a young technician whose calm hands could dismantle and reassemble any code machine faster than most engineers could follow. Marta specialized in encoding intelligence within schematics. Tiny deviations in diagrams, minor adjustments in gears, subtle markings on blueprints, all carried critical information to Allied forces. Every shipment of typewriters or coding devices that left Adler now contained the seeds of disruption. The factory's corridors became a secret network of communication. Workers exchanged messages hidden in seemingly mundane paperwork, folded into complex origami to avoid detection. Jakob had devised a system of code phrases and hand signals that allowed them to coordinate without uttering a word. Even the machines themselves served as couriers. A misprinted character here, a key pressed in a peculiar sequence there, could alert another worker to new developments or potential Gestapo inspections. Outside, the Reich pressed harder. Supply lines were stretched thin, manpower was depleted, and the Gestapo's presence in Frankfurt became almost omnipresent. Officers made random visits to factories, interrogating workers, searching for signs of dissent. But Adler's subversive network moved with calculated precision. A secret tunnel beneath the main assembly hall, originally constructed for storage, had been converted into a refuge where stolen blueprints and encoded messages could be safeguarded. Each worker knew the paths, the hiding places, and the exact steps to take if a surprise inspection occurred. One evening, as snow fell in a silent blanket over the city, Jakob convened the core group in the hidden room beneath the factory. Maps of the European theater were spread across the table, annotated with routes of German convoys, locations of key communication hubs, and schedules of code machine deliveries. Jakob traced a finger along the map, eyes sharp with determination. Every machine we ship is now a weapon. Every document a source of intelligence. We do not need to confront them openly. Our victory is in the smallest, quietest of details. The Reich will not see us coming. The months that followed were a continuous dance between risk and precision. Defective typewriter springs caused critical delays in bureaucratic reports. Misaligned gears in code machines scrambled messages, sowing confusion among officers who prided themselves on order. Allied intelligence began to notice patterns, repeated mechanical failures that could not be attributed to mere wear and tear, errors in encryption that hinted at deliberate tampering. Slowly, the network of spies and resistance fighters outside Frankfurt began connecting the dots. The Adler typewriter factory, once an ordinary industrial hub, had become a linchpin in the invisible battlefield of sabotage. Within the factory, the human element of the rebellion grew more pronounced. Fear was ever present. Workers had seen colleagues arrested for the smallest infraction, neighbors disappear in the dead of night, and families torn apart by suspicion and betrayal. Yet, this fear did not paralyze them. It sharpened their awareness and honed their ingenuity. Each act of sabotage was meticulously planned, a blend of technical skill and psychological warfare. Jakob encouraged his team to imagine the effects of their interventions not just in Frankfurt, but across the hundreds of kilometers where these machines would ultimately end up: mess halls, command offices, front lines, and bunkers. The Gestapo's scrutiny intensified as rumors of sabotage swirled. Officers conducted thorough searches of the assembly floors, interrogated the managers, and even questioned the factory's owner. But Jakob's preparation was exhaustive. False compartments, cleverly hidden notes, and mechanical decoys ensured that nothing incriminating was ever discovered. On multiple occasions, Gestapo agents left the factory convinced of its workers' loyalty, unaware that the very machines they praised were now conduits of disorder. At night, after the factory lights dimmed and the machines fell silent, Jakob would walk alone among the snow-covered streets of Frankfurt. Each step reminded him of the stakes. Every misstep could cost lives. Every discovery could destroy months of careful work. Yet he also felt a quiet pride. The ordinary people of Adler, The machinists, clerks, and technicians were doing the extraordinary. Each key struck, each gear aligned with subtle imperfection, was a defiance of tyranny. By the end of 1943, the effects of their work were becoming impossible to ignore. German units reported miscommunications, misplaced orders, and malfunctioning equipment across Europe. Allied officers quietly celebrated the inexplicable failures of the Reich's bureaucracy, unaware at first that a small factory in Frankfurt was responsible. For Jakob and his team, the success was bittersweet. Each victory in sabotage reminded them of the human cost of the war, of friends lost and families shattered. Yet, the thought that their quiet resistance could save lives, disrupt military operations, and undermine the Nazi regime lent them courage to continue. The Adler typewriter factory had evolved. What had once been a place of routine labor had become a theater of covert operations, a crucible in which courage, ingenuity, and desperation fused into a silent weapon of enormous power. And as winter deepened over Frankfurt, Jakob knew that the seeds of sabotage sown within these walls would grow into consequences far beyond the reach of the Gestapo, far beyond the control of the Reich, shaping the outcome of the war in ways the Nazis could never imagine. Spring 1944 arrived in Frankfurt with an uneasy warmth, a deceptive calm that belied the chaos brewing across the European theater of war. The streets, now lined with early blossoms struggling through the bombed-out remnants of buildings, echoed with the distant rumbles of military vehicles and the relentless rhythm of warplanes overhead. Inside the Adler typewriter factory, however, another kind of storm was gathering, a quiet but devastating upheaval that would begin to turn the tide against the Nazi war machine. Jakob Stein moved through the assembly lines like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of subtle rebellion. Each typewriter, each code machine carried the fingerprints of their secret network. Springs were misaligned in ways so minute that a casual inspector would never notice, yet on the battlefield or in a command office, these tiny flaws translated into catastrophic errors. Gear teeth were deliberately filed uneven, causing machines to jam at critical moments. Encoders and ciphers, which were supposed to transmit precise military instructions, instead scrambled crucial messages just enough to sow confusion among officers. The human cost was ever present in Jakob's mind. He and his team had watched neighbors disappear, seen colleagues vanish in the dead of night, their fate the silent warning to the rest. Yet this fear sharpened their focus rather than diminished it. Each worker became a specialist in deception and resilience. Marta Weiss, who had mastered the art of embedding encoded intelligence into technical schematics, now trained others in reading and writing messages invisible to the uninitiated. A misaligned lever, a slightly incorrect symbol on a diagram, these small, painstaking acts of subversion had become their weaponry. By mid-1944, the ripple effects of Adler's sabotage began to manifest in undeniable ways. German units reported repeated failures in communication, misallocated resources, and operational delays. Messerschmitt pilots found their flight paths scrambled by faulty code machines, causing near misses and grounded missions. U-boat patrols received conflicting coordinates, leaving fleets idle and exposed to Allied attacks. The Nazi command, accustomed to meticulous precision, was suddenly grappling with anomalies it could neither predict nor comprehend. Jakob's vision had evolved. Sabotage was no longer just a defensive act. It had become offensive. He orchestrated the creation of deliberately misleading documents, designed to misdirect entire battalions, confuse supply chains, and provoke errors in operational planning. Each shipment from Adler now contained not only subtle mechanical defects, but also falsified intelligence that, when acted upon, would lead officers astray. The factory's workstations became laboratories of psychological warfare, where ordinary clerks and machinists wielded the power of strategy against an empire. Despite the growing impact of their actions, the Gestapo's scrutiny intensified. Officers conducted unannounced inspections, interrogated managers, and meticulously examined every shipment of machinery leaving the factory. On several occasions, Gestapo agents lingered too long, their eyes lingering over components and schematics, suspicion flashing in their gaze. Yet Jakob and his team had anticipated these intrusions. Hidden compartments, decoy blueprints, and cleverly disguised modifications ensured that nothing overtly incriminating could be found. The inspectors left reassured, entirely unaware that the very devices they praised were instruments of systemic disruption. The human drama within the factory was intense. Workers labored under the constant weight of fear, yet their shared purpose created bonds stronger than the oppressive regime around them. They developed silent signals, subtle gestures, and unspoken codes that allowed them to communicate the smallest details of sabotage without drawing attention. Even the machines themselves became conduits of their secret language. A slightly off keystroke, a misprinted symbol, a gear that resisted motion, all became signals of intelligence carefully encoded and passed along the chain. Jakob understood that the psychological aspect of their work was as vital as the mechanical. He held secret meetings with small groups, reinforcing the importance of resilience and calm under pressure. "We are the invisible hand guiding chaos," he would whisper. "We are the eyes the Reich cannot see. Every machine we ship, every document we alter, every keystroke we press is another thread unraveling their order." These words, quiet yet electrifying, instilled confidence in the workers, who now saw themselves as more than laborers. They were architects of disruption, agents of change, shaping the fate of the war from within the confines of a factory. The effects of their sabotage extended far beyond Frankfurt. Reports of logistical failures and communication breakdowns reached the highest echelons of the Nazi command. Orders intended to reinforce embattled positions arrived scrambled or delayed. Supplies were delivered to the wrong units. Military strategists found themselves fighting not just the Allies, but a pervasive, inexplicable inefficiency that defied explanation. Slowly, the Allies began to detect a pattern, tracing the failures back to the source. The Adler typewriter factory, an unlikely epicenter of resistance, had become a crucial instrument in undermining the Reich's operations across Europe. By late 1944, Jakob's team faced both triumph and peril. Their work was increasingly effective, yet the Gestapo's investigations grew relentless. Neighbors and co-workers disappeared without explanation, a grim reminder of the stakes involved. Despite this, the factory maintained its outward appearance of efficiency and loyalty. On the surface, production remained impeccable. Beneath it, however, a carefully constructed web of sabotage and intelligence gathering continued to expand, a silent force that the Nazis could neither see nor comprehend. In these months, the Adler typewriter factory became more than a place of work. It became a symbol of human ingenuity and courage under oppression. Ordinary people, armed with nothing more than precision, intelligence, and quiet resolve, had begun to shape the trajectory of the war. The machines they built and altered, intended to enforce control, had instead become agents of chaos. And within the factory walls, the heartbeat of resistance grew stronger with each passing day, preparing to turn the tide of war in ways the Reich could never anticipate. Jacob would often linger in the empty corridors late at night, listening to the residual hum of machinery, imagining the cascading impact of their work: battalions misdirected, convoys delayed, commanders frustrated by unexplainable errors. Every act of sabotage, no matter how small, was a victory in itself, a testament to the fact that even in the darkest hours, ordinary people could wield extraordinary power. The tide of the war was turning, not with guns or tanks, but with keystrokes, gears, and the quiet genius of those who refused to serve tyranny. March 1945. Frankfurt lay under a gray, restless sky, the city scarred by years of bombing and occupation. Smoke curled from crumbling buildings, and the streets were littered with remnants of a society stretched thin by war. The Nazi regime, once imposing and absolute, was fraying under the relentless advance of Allied forces from the West and the East. The Reich's bureaucratic and military apparatus, still determined to cling to power, relied on every remaining code machine and typewriter to maintain its crumbling command. Inside the Adler typewriter factory, Jakob Stein moved with a quiet intensity, sensing that the moment for the most daring strike had arrived. Months of careful sabotage, subtle mechanical adjustments, and encoded intelligence had brought the factory to a point of perfect readiness. Now, the final stage of their plan would unfold. Every shipment of typewriters, code machines, and operational documents leaving the factory would become a weapon capable of crippling Nazi communications at the highest levels. Jacob convened his core team in the hidden room beneath the factory, its walls lined with schematics, blueprints, and coded messages waiting to be dispatched. The tension in the room was palpable, each worker aware that the margin for error was razor thin. Marta Weiss, the young technician who had become the architect of coded intelligence, carefully reviewed the final alterations to the encryption devices. Each machine had been meticulously calibrated to fail at critical moments, gears slightly misaligned, coding sequences subtly reversed, key levers adjusted to jam after a specific number of uses. Even the typewriters, seemingly mundane, contained hidden errors that would produce corrupted messages and bureaucratic chaos. "Once these machines reach Berlin," Jakob said quietly, "the Reich will have no way of knowing what is real and what is false. Orders will contradict themselves, instructions will be misread, and their entire command structure will unravel from within. We do not need to face them in battle. They will destroy themselves." His words were calm, but carried the weight of months of planning, sacrifice, and relentless courage. The factory staff worked feverishly to prepare the shipments. Each typewriter was inspected, not for perfection, but for strategic imperfection. Encoders were tested to ensure their failure would appear natural yet consequential. Manuals and operational instructions were deliberately altered to mislead officers, while true intelligence was carefully hidden in subtle, almost invisible markings. Every detail was precise, the culmination of years of secret labor. Outside, the city was tense with fear and uncertainty. The Gestapo had intensified surveillance as rumors of sabotage spread through the Reich. Officers inspected deliveries, questioned drivers, and monitored communication channels. Yet none suspected the full scale of the factory's defiance. Jakob's team had anticipated every possible inspection. Decoy components, false blueprints, and hidden compartments ensured that even the most meticulous search would yield nothing. The Nazis believed Adler's output flawless, unaware that the very machines they relied upon had become instruments of their own undoing. When the first shipments reached Berlin, the effects were immediate and catastrophic. Orders for troop movements were misinterpreted, resulting in battalions being deployed to incorrect locations. Supply deliveries arrived at empty bases or enemy-controlled zones. Encryption devices, meant to secure critical communications, produced garbled messages that officers could not decipher in time. Panic rippled through the command structure, as men trained to follow procedure found themselves helplessly entangled in a web of errors that seemed impossible to explain. Across Germany, reports of mechanical failures and miscommunication multiplied. A key operation intended to reinforce a faltering front collapsed due to conflicting orders. Air units missed targets, convoys became lost in the countryside, and critical ammunition shipments failed to reach their destinations. The Allies, who had noticed the pattern of disruption over the past year, now saw its full scale. Intelligence officers realized that the source of this chaos was not a single act of espionage, but the systematic sabotage orchestrated by a factory in Frankfurt, a revelation both improbable and monumental. Inside the Adler factory, Jakob and his team monitored developments with cautious satisfaction. They had witnessed the human cost of war firsthand: the neighbors lost, the friends executed, the families torn apart. But now, their months of meticulous work were altering the course of history. Each key struck, each gear misaligned, each coded message concealed in plain sight was now delivering a decisive blow against the Reich. As Allied forces approached Frankfurt, Jakob allowed himself a moment of reflection. The factory, once a symbol of bureaucratic efficiency and industrial might, had become a crucible of resistance. Ordinary men and women, armed with nothing but skill, intelligence, and quiet courage, had succeeded in turning the instruments of tyranny against their masters. The Nazis, blinded by arrogance and overconfidence, had fallen victim to their own dependence on the machinery they thought infallible. In the streets of Berlin, confusion reached its peak. Officers shouted contradictory orders, messages were ignored or misread, and operational coherence collapsed. High-ranking officials scrambled to salvage command, unaware that the chaos was not random, but the result of deliberate, calculated sabotage emanating from Frankfurt. The war machine, for all its might and technological sophistication, had been undone by a network of ordinary humans who refused to be complicit. When the Allied troops finally entered Frankfurt, Jakob and his team emerged from the shadows. Exhausted but alive, they walked past the factory that had become a fortress of resistance. Outside, the city bore the scars of war, yet within its walls lay the legacy of defiance. A factory that had quietly, invisibly, and effectively dismantled the operations of a brutal regime. Jacob knew the risk was far from over. The Gestapo still roamed, and the Reich was not yet defeated. But the most critical strike had been delivered. The final act of sabotage had turned a simple industrial plant into the Nazis' most feared and unrecognized adversary. And so, in March 1945, the Adler typewriter factory stood as a testament to the power of human ingenuity and courage. What had been ordinary labor had become extraordinary resistance. The machines, designed for control, had become instruments of liberation. Jakob and his colleagues, ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, had shown that even in the darkest hours, subtle, deliberate action could topple tyranny. Their work, invisible to the world, had struck the Reich at its most vulnerable point, and in doing so, changed the course of history.